Blonde is a fictional biographical drama film based on the book of the same name by Joyce Carol Oates. The book is a critically acclaimed piece of work and was even nominated for the Pulitzer Prize back in 2000. In just a few weeks of release, the film has already stirred some attention and controversy. It's the first NC-17 film on a streaming platform. It stars a Cuban actress as the lead, Ana de Armas, who you might recognize from Knives Out and the most recent James Bond film, and it's been called out by some critics as an exploitation film rather than a commentary. So, I watched it. Despite the controversy, I kept an open mind and was looking forward to it. While I do agree with some of what the critics are saying, there's a lot more to discuss about the movie on why it, mostly, fails. And there are some interesting layers to it too that I think are worth highlighting. We're going to look at not just how the film was made, what could have been better, etc., but also dig into what the intention was behind this film, and discuss the nuances buried within, if there are any. Was the film justified in its portrayal of Marilyn Monroe? Is she meant to be seen as a person, or a vehicle for a hidden message? Is there a line we should draw between biographies, public figures, and artistic freedom? We're going to cover all of those topics and more. This video essay will have spoilers, so if you're interested in watching Blonde, I would just click out of the video right now. I'll also put a few trigger warnings here for not just this video, but also for the film itself. I highly recommend you read these before you do either. Okay, let's get into it. Blonde follows the title character, Marilyn Monroe, real name Norma Jean, into her life briefly as a child, as an adult, and the events leading up to her death, all through highlights of her career told in a series of snapshot narratives. One very glaring detail about this movie is that it immediately hones in on the childhood traumatic experiences that Norma Jean likely endured. While the story is fictionalized, a lot of what she dealt with in real life is put in the film, including her time in foster care and an orphanage. If there's one main theme to the movie, it's abuse. Just all shades of it. It starts with Norma Jean's grieving, unstable mother, who attempts to drown her in bathwater at the beginning of the film, and continues through a pattern of male relationships that use and abuse Norma Jean in physical, psychological, and sexual ways. We're conditioned to view Norma Jean as a victim, and only a victim. On top of that, we're only given snapshots of how she began her career as a pinup model, which is how she got her start in the industry. There isn't usually a problem with using abuse as a storytelling device if it's handled with intelligence, empathy, and purpose. In this film, it ultimately becomes tired and dry when you find out that aside from her state of victimhood, there's not much to know or find intriguing about Norma Jean as a character. Norma Jean is portrayed as a doe-eyed ingenue stuck in the face of a young, troubled girl. You can tell that the film thinks this is a profound and deep way of examining the character through the lens of childhood trauma. The decision to portray her locked in this childlike state could be rooted in her much-rumored dysfunctional relationships with men. The film suggests that this could have started with her absentee father. Yes, super original, I know. One example of this is Norma Jean referring to all of her lovers as daddy, and no, I'm not kidding. They also respond to it, which is a pretty detestable and shallow-minded way of approaching these issues, though I'm not sure whether to blame the film or the book for that one. Aside from that, is there anything of value to take away from this? Well, in one way, Norma Jean's obsessive, fractured relationships with men and her subconscious craving for the presence of her father can be linked to a psychological concept known as a father complex, or, even more specifically, the Electra complex. According to psychology website The Health Board, an Electra complex is characterized by abuse, neglect, or abandonment, and can manifest in adulthood in various ways, including self-destructive behaviors and toxic romantic partnerships. We can see elements of the Electra complex in the writing for Norma Jean all throughout the film, though in some hokey, bizarre, and even outrageous ways. There's also this impending theme of motherhood and loss of motherhood, both through the perspective of Norma Jean's mother and herself. We get subjected to some intense shots of a womb, the fetus floating inside, and Marilyn's love for her unborn child. Whether this is linked to Norma Jean's issues or not is debatable, but I'd like to think that there's some relation between the two. This is another example of the film trying to dig a little deeper than it can pull off. The scenes seem constructed purely for shock value, with a horrific undertone that blends into a surreal, disturbing atmosphere. Sometimes it works, sometimes it falls flat on its face. There's no in-between. There was opportunity to create something meaningful here. Since Norma Jean's mentally unwell mother didn't want her, it feels like a potential contrast to Norma Jean wanting a child of her own, and ultimately failing to have them. This is merely suggestion. The movie doesn't really tie this together. Maybe I'm projecting since this is what I would have done if I had a filmmaking team and a few $1 million. Anyway, despite how it's executed, Ana de Armas's performance is pretty convincing on screen. It's not enough to save the movie from its self-absorbed, fake deep outlook on Marilyn Monroe, but she does make for a convincing caricature of the woman she's inspired by. Or at least, one dimension of her. Since, yes, even with all this talk about complexes and psychological issues and trauma and abuse, they're just talk. You don't feel much of everything. Or anything. There's a huge disconnect between the viewer and what's happening on screen. Whatever message the film is trying to convey is squandered because of its narrow-minded view of its own story. Instead of using these themes and ideas as a vehicle to examine Norma Jean through layers outside of tragedy, it's only used as a filter for abuse. The dominating theme of male abuse, in particular, leaves Norma Jean battered, broken, and lost. She seeks validation through men because of these issues, which leads to her victimization by these men. There are two fictionalized representations of powerful men that I won't reveal in this essay, but their sole existence is to abuse Norma Jean and continue this perpetual cycle. The thing is, these characterizations are hearsay. The fictional narrative decided to perpetuate this theme of male-inflicted sexual abuse on a woman. It's horrifying to watch, and it does make you empathize, but it's done in such an odd way that it feels ultimately purposeless. With potentially one or two exceptions to the rule, all male characters that Norma Jean interacts with betray her romantically, sexually, and physically in some way. Instead of positioning her as a character with motivations, dreams, and ambition, we're left with a battered caricature of a woman who left behind a great legacy. That's one of the biggest issues with Blonde. It's so in love with itself that it doesn't see how shallow it really is. Its main protagonist is passive and constantly on the receiving end of events. We never see more than one side to her, and that side is the abused, saddened, broken part. You could argue that this is the point. Is the film trying to say that women, in general, are subject to this kind of abuse in Hollywood, and that's the main way they obtain their success? Is it trying to say that Norma Jean, in particular, could not have obtained her success without the abuse of men? To be fair, there's so much we don't know about Marilyn Monroe's life. Even though we don't know everything, we do know this. She was a child in foster care, she was a sex symbol, she started her career as a pinup model, married her first husband at 16, and, as far as we know, lived a lavish, sad, fulfilling, famous, and hard life until her tragic passing at just 36 years old. The film wants to paint the sides of Norma Jean that could have been real. Her grief, her shattered mind, her broken heart, her miscarriages, her loss of a father figure, her obsession with proving herself to her mother and winning her love. To the film's credit, we don't know what Norma Jean was thinking in her darkest days and what drove her to suicide. The internet already seems obsessed with making her death a conspiracy theory, and this one actually does respect what we know, as of now, about her passing. That it was a suicide, and that there were reasons she found herself in that place. Maybe there are some truths here that we're too uncomfortable to notice. Blonde is filmed in both black and white and color, with most of the scenes shown through a harsh film grade that matches the golden age of Hollywood. It's beautiful to look at, haunting, and molds into a surreal atmosphere. Part of this is owed to the unconventional narrative style, which shows Norma Jean's life in pieces, rather than in a clear series of arcs. Interestingly, the movie doesn't have a clear balance on when it's black and white and when it's shown in color, with the exception of one scene. At first, I thought the pattern was that all of Norma Jean's sad moments were shown in black and white, which I guess would be the whole movie, let's be honest, and her happy moments would be in color. This was not the case, as both themes in her story are showcased in black and white and color. Now, the one exception I mentioned just a few seconds ago is a series of scenes where Norma Jean is truly happy, pregnant, and enjoying her third marriage to the playwright Arthur Miller, played by Adrian Brody. The colors are vibrant, lots of pinks, blues, and greens, the pure picture of summer and nostalgic bliss. These scenes are filmed almost like a video diary, including the only man who does not treat Norma Jean with outstanding cruelty. This entire sequence was pretty well done. not because of the narrative through dialogue, but because of how it was presented. The consistency in choosing color over black and white, and making a clear statement on Norma Jean's happiness and her hopes for a new beginning. In a way, it's her paradise. This is probably the only part of the film that I think stood out in a positive way. Unfortunately, it's about 4 minutes of the 2.5-hour runtime. Speaking of which, at the end of this chapter, the film shifts into a heartbreaking return to black and white when Norma Jean suffers through a miscarriage. This turning point plunges her into an irretrievable darkness, madness, and loss of self that feature the strongest points of the film from both a writing and visual perspective. The problem is that it still lingers in this laziness, shifting from one Hollywood photographic style to the next. The momentum it starts to build with this drops quickly, once you realize that the second dimension you thought you were getting from Norma Jean is actually just the same dimension turned at a slightly different angle. It's like when you first start making coffee at home instead of buying your go-to drink at your favorite local shop. Disappointing, but expected. Even so, I have to wonder why the film was structured this way. The first trailer made me believe that the entire thing would be in black and white, which I thought was a smart and stylish way to go. It's not just color that defines the film's style either. It shifts between different aspect ratios, drawing your attention in certain scenes compared to others. The director has even stated that he wanted the aspect ratios to reflect photographs and film of the time. Unfortunately, this choice feels distracting and random. One of the most controversial elements of the film, and what people are complaining about the most, is the fact that Norma Jean is victimized, brutalized, and dehumanized. Which, yes, we all agree there. Would be shocked if anyone walked into this movie and thought, wow, that was such a wholesome experience. The comment about how the film fails in providing commentary because of its use of exploitation is what I don't agree with. Let me explain. The movie does exploit her, there's no question. It creates some of her most famous moments, including the white dress publicity stunt, her career as a pinup model, her status as a sex symbol, her navigating an industry run by powerful men. However, the movie isn't trying to say that it's not exploiting her. Her sexual and physical exploitation is, in my opinion, the point of the film entirely. Is the point well made? You probably know the answer to that. Regardless, how can anyone commentate on anything without contributing to it in some way? It depends on how the film treats it. Does it praise the abuse or condemn it? Blonde exploits Norma Jean, but in a way that does not lead to gratification. From what I could tell, the depiction of SA, abuse, and more are not glamorized in the slightest. Her trauma, while a bit dull and one-sided in depiction, is not shown in a fetishized way. It's completely bare in its brutality. When we ask for brutally honest representations of real-life people, what do we expect? Do we want the film to be surface level, or do we want them to be honest and dive into those gritty, uncomfortable details? Right now, more discussion is happening around the ethics of bringing these elements into film. Since it's art, and Norma Jean was a public figure, I'd like to think that trying to control art is a dangerous move. However, I do think we can be respectful when approaching these subjects, and do them justice. Just because you make a movie with the intention of showing and commentating on sensitive topics does not mean that it's automatically good. Even more so, it does not mean that you're entitled to your audience thinking it's good. Now, all that being said, Blonde is based on a work of fiction that has been published and floating around for 22 years. Joyce Carol Oates, the author of the original novel, very clearly states that the work is fiction, and this is not meant to be a by-the-numbers biography of Marilyn Monroe's life. Because of this, you could argue that the rules change. In that sense, we're not watching a film that's trying to be a retelling of Marilyn's life, but an exploration of a fictional story using her as a centerpiece. It's possible that the book gets across a lot more than what the film does. On top of that, Marilyn Monroe is not the only fictionalized version of herself that faces some questionable and, if this was claiming to be based on real life, defamatory interpretations. Her husbands, lovers, and assailants are all based on real-life figures. While everyone is talking about Marilyn Monroe being unfairly treated in the film, we need to remember that this treatment does not only apply to her. However, I don't think this film is exploitative without reason. It exploits Marilyn because it believes it has something to say, and refuses to look at her abuse in a positive light. It's seen as monstrous because what the movie is portraying is monstrous. Her victimization is the point of the entire movie. The key takeaway is that the film thinks it has something to say. It really does believe it. It's quite full of itself for that exact reason. No matter the direction it takes, the film fails to recognize that the lead character was not just a victim of his sexual and physical abuse, childhood trauma, and her own demons. In fact, Norma Jean was articulate, highly intelligent, well-read, with over 400 books in her private library, witty, loved art, wrote poetry, and was extremely tough. She stood up for herself against producers in a time where that sort of story could have easily gotten you fired, beautiful or no. As a person from that era, how could she not be these things and so much more? Did that mean she was not difficult to work with? No. No human is without their flaws. Did this mean she was not crazy? No one can know. Only those close to her truly knew her, and even then, maybe they only understood the surface. The disappointment in Blonde isn't in the movie itself, but in the fact that we haven't gotten a truly in-depth, broad scope, and intelligent deep dive into who Norma Jean was as a person. I decided to investigate the director, Andrew Dominik. Dominik has a rather niche filmography, having directed and written films like Killing Them Softly, Chopper, and The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. His footprint in the industry is comprised of neo-noir, western, and more experimental drama films. Needless to say, he's not afraid to take risks. In a recent interview, Dominik comments on his depiction of Marilyn Monroe. "I've read everything there is to read about Marilyn Monroe. I've met people that knew her. I've done an enormous amount of research. But in the end, it's about the book. And adapting the book is really about adapting the feelings that the book gave me. I see the film, in some ways, as Joyce's vision of Marilyn, which is also really Joyce. So I think the film is about the meaning of Marilyn Monroe, or a meaning. She was symbolic of something. She was the Aphrodite of the 20th century, the American goddess of love, and she killed herself. So what does that mean?" He has a point. What does that mean? And what does that mean for the film? While it doesn't excuse any of the awkward, objectively bad decisions, it does show a more thoughtful intent. One thing that stood out to me was his referring to Marilyn Monroe as a meaning or a symbol of something. He's clear that he's not sure what that symbol is, but he's determined to show some sort of interpretation based on the book. On another note, at least in this interview I found, there's not one mention of the film being planned as a literal, step-by-step life story of Marilyn Monroe. This aids the argument that the film was meant to be a fictionalized biography from the very beginning, and not the more traditional biography that audiences likely expected. In the same article, Dominik also claims that his film is a rescue fantasy, and that we have a special intimacy with her character. I think he does have a point with that last statement. We do feel a connection to people like Marilyn Monroe. We project our ideas and identities onto people we admire. Strangers will never know, but feel connected to through pages, silver screens, and dreams far beyond our reach. It's human nature to latch onto something, or someone, that moves you. Which brings us to our next topic. We're drawn to people like Marilyn Monroe, Princess Diana, Audrey Hepburn, and others because we're still so far away from them. We don't feel as attached to them the same way we perceive our attachments with modern-day celebrities. If you've been involved in the circle of Marilyn Monroe topics for a while, you know about the conspiracies. Reddit posts, YouTube videos, professional articles, all diving into this morbid theory that Norma Jean wasn't suicidal and that her death was murder. We can owe some of this growing speculation to the rise in true crime popularity, but there's something to say as well about Norma Jean being a target. We don't know everything about her, and so we're pulled in by that mystery. That will never change. When you come across an interesting topic, it becomes an adrenaline rush, the insatiable urge to solve it, but at the same time wanting to always live in that era of uncertainty and mystery. Marilyn Monroe was also a fashion icon, extremely beautiful, and her body type is even more heralded today than it was back then. Her style and influence is admirable and copied by celebrities. Remember Kim Kardashian wearing her dress at the Met Gala? Marilyn is distant and mysterious, so we're drawn to her allure. She's gorgeous and smart, so we want to understand her. We fell in love with a side to her shown through the public eye, and only the public eye. We fell into fascination with her when we saw just how much of her mystery we'll never figure out. Blonde is yet another chapter of the Marilyn Monroe saga, a disappointing, artistic depiction of a fictional identity inspired by her, not meant to portray her, scene for scene. When a movie loves itself this much, it's hard not to get wrapped up in its pretension. I watched the movie because of both the internal and external scope. I wanted to know how it was made, why people were so mad about it, and why we're obsessed with fighting for the rights of the dead. It makes me wonder about the future of biographical films. Are we only allowed to support them when they're innately positive? What expectations should we have? Blonde is a fictional biography, and yet it's been marketed and treated like it was trying to be something else. In both accounts, it failed to build a compelling lead and used her trauma as a vehicle for a thinly written story that could have been masterful. In my opinion, the film's greatest sin isn't that it exploits Norma Jean physically, but that it doesn't even try to do something new or different. Once again, we're given a stale, abused woman's story who was portrayed far less than she was, haunted by demons that rob her of any complexity, intellect, or ambition she may have had. I'm sure there will be many more movies covering people like Marilyn Monroe. We'll continue discussing them, analyzing them, complaining about them, and watching them. Our curiosity is simply too great.